Hey everybody, welcome back. This is a quick little virtual lecture for Econ 1A. We aren't having class on Monday, September 27th, so I wanted to review the material from Chapter 4, the Market Forces of Supply and Demand, and go ahead and give you a preview of Chapter 5, Measuring National Growth. We should be able to get through this stuff pretty quickly, but I figured it'd be worth it to spend some time going ahead and getting a good review of it. And so hopefully you have the time to take a look at this either on Monday or over the weekend or before class on Wednesday, and it'll give you a good sense of where we are. So this week, week 5, we're going to be looking at measuring the economy by measuring growth and measuring national income. So let's get into the slides that I've got posted for you all up on Canvas. So in looking at what we've done so far, we started out with our introduction to economics, which included Mankiw's 10 principles, thinking like an economist, looking at concepts like scarcity, opportunity cost, that kind of thing. And then we looked at the gains from trade. We looked at the models like the circular flow model, the production possibilities frontier. And then this last week, what we've done in week 4 is look at supply and demand. We use the model of supply and demand to analyze competitive markets where there's lots of buyers and sellers, there's clear information, and no one individual firm or seller or buyer has the ability to control the market. We have demand that shows the quantity of a good that consumers are willing and able to demand at any given price. So whatever the price is, there is some quantity demanded by all the consumers in a market. According to the law of demand, as the price of a good falls, that quantity demanded is going to rise, which is why we get that downward sloping demand curve, right? On the other hand, if the price of the good goes up, we're going to demand less of it. And so we want to remember, and I'm just going to draw this for us really quickly, that we're going to expect a downward sloping demand curve because of that relationship between price and quantity. As price goes down, quantity demanded goes up, and that gives us our downward sloping demand curve. Movement along the curve is a change in quantity demanded. So if price changes, we move along that demand curve. On the other hand, a change in one of those non-price determinants, that's going to shift the curve. So we can see quantity demanded change at every price if we have a change in the number of buyers, a change in income, a change in the price of a related good like a complement or a substitute, a change in tastes and preferences, or a change in expectations. Any of those won't move us along the curve, but rather would shift us out or in to create a new demand curve, right? If you're still fuzzy on that, go ahead and take a look at that Chapter 4 material and see if that doesn't help, or send me an email and let me know. We also talked about the supply side. Supply side is a parallel to that demand side. It looks at firm behavior, right? Firms' willingness and ability to sell goods and services. There is a quantity supplied at every price level. There is a law of supply that says that firms are willing and able to supply more goods to a market as price goes up, which is where we get an upward sloping supply curve. Just like with demand, we can have movement along the curve based on a change in price. We can also have the curve shift based on a change in one of the non-price determinants of supply. And so we're going to expect our supply curve to always be upward sloping, and it will shift if we see a change in a non-price determinant of supply. Input prices, technology, number of sellers, and expectations are our 4 non-price determinants of supply. We put supply and demand together, and we get an equilibrium quantity and price, right? Make sense? At the equilibrium price, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Both buyers and sellers are the best off they could possibly be. If we have a price above equilibrium, say up here, we're going to have a surplus because quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. If prices are too low, we would have quantity demanded be greater than quantity supplied, and we'd have a shortage, right? Lower the price too low or anywhere below equilibrium, more people will want to buy it, fewer firms will want to sell it. Raise the price too high, firms will want to sell it, but no one will want to buy it. And so where we want to be, it turns out, is in equilibrium. And then the last thing we did was we said that we could determine the outcome of any change in the market by analyzing which curve is affected, which way it's affected, is it shifting the curve out or in, and then what the new equilibrium is, okay? And that's what the homework is going to ask you to do a lot of, is creating those, putting those all together. So, here's another little reminder. So a change in supply, movement along the supply curve versus a change in quantity supplied, a change in supply is shifting the curve, right? Changing quantity supplied at every price. That's going to be change in input costs, technology, prices of related goods and services, expectations. A change in quantity supplied is movement along the curve. And we have the same thing for the demand side. We can see demand change at every price level if the demand curve shifts. And that's going to be changes in the price of related goods, income, number of buyers, tastes and preferences, or expectations, whereas a change in price just moves us along the curve. So, Chapter 5 asks us to get into that macroeconomic headspace. Now we're going to be talking about the whole economy. And the first thing we want to do is measure national income. The way we measure national income is with GDP, or gross domestic product. So we're going to find out what GDP is, how it's related to national spending, what the components of GDP are, and how we correct GDP for inflation. And then we'll talk about whether or not GDP does a good job of measuring society's well-being. So the first thing we want to do is talk about what GDP is. Gross domestic product, or GDP, measures the total income of everyone in the country. And so what it's really measuring is how many goods and services are we producing and how much are they worth. So it's a measure of the total expenditure on an economy's output. It's basically like our total national income. And that's what we're thinking of it as, right? Because we're talking about measuring national income. And so what we're doing is measuring how much money is spent on our goods and services. And that works because every dollar that a buyer spends on something is income for the seller who sold the thing, right? And that actually kind of gets back to the circular flow diagram in a way. And so we have a really specific definition of GDP that helps us remember what is and is not included. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country within a given period of time. And we're going to go through because each section of this definition has a specific meaning and is included for a specific reason. So, market value. GDP is the market value for all final goods and services produced within a country within a given period of time. The first important thing is that the goods are valued at their market prices. So everything's going to be measured in the same units. If we're talking about US GDP, it's going to be dollars. We don't include things that don't have a market value, things that aren't sold in the legitimate market. So doing chores doesn't have a market value. It doesn't contribute to GDP unless someone pays you for it in like the legal marketplace. So anything that doesn't have a market value is not going to be built into GDP. Watching your friend's kid for free, that doesn't have a market value. It's not part of GDP. Final goods, the market value of all final goods, means that the good is being consumed by the end user. And what we're trying to differentiate here between is final goods and intermediate goods. So intermediate goods are like materials. Final goods are when something is finally being sold for like the last time. So think about tires versus a car, right? If a car company buys tires to put on a car to sell a car, the tires are an intermediate good. They are part of the process of making the car. The final good is the car with the tires included. And the reason we want to only think about and only include final goods is we don't want to double count stuff, right? So if I am let's say I'm selling a car. I want that car counted in GDP. That's a final good. It's sold in this year and it's produced in this year, and I want it counted as part of GDP. But if the tires were also counted in GDP and the metal and the fabric were all counted before they came to the car company, that would mean that basically we're double counting the car because we count all the intermediate goods and the final good. Then you could even go the next level before that and say, okay, well, the rubber for the tire, does that count as GDP? And so you could see how things could sort of be counted over and over and over again. So to prevent that, we only count final goods that are being used by their intended final end user, not intermediate goods, not ingredients, not components. Does that make sense? So we're talking about only measuring stuff that is sort of at the end of its production process. So GDP only includes final goods because they embody the value of all the intermediate goods, right? It's already built in, those intermediate good values. Finally, goods and services, well, that means that we want to include tangible goods, DVDs, mountain bikes, beer, pizza, shoes, textbooks. It also includes services. So you want to think about accounting services, medical services, concerts, cell phone service, dry cleaning, car wash. Those are all final goods and services that we want to make sure GDP is counting. Produced means that we only want to get currently produced goods. And so this is a little bit less important, but we'll talk about it more as we talk about that period of time part. But we want to make sure that we're talking about currently produced goods produced in this period, whatever that period is, usually a year. Within a country means we are only counting goods that are produced here, domestically. So when we're measuring the GDP for, say, the United States, we want to measure the goods and services that are produced in the United States. If something is produced by somewhere else, by China or South Korea, it's not our productivity. And so we don't want to measure it. We want to measure our productivity, right? Our ability to produce goods and services. And so we want to make sure that we're only counting goods that are produced domestically. And then we want to keep it into a set period of time. Usually it's a year or a quarter, sometimes it's a month, but generally GDP is measuring whatever goods and services, market value of final goods and services produced within a country within that set period of time. And again, this gets to this idea of not double counting, making sure that we only count stuff that's produced right now, not stuff that was produced previously and might have been counted last year, or stuff that we're going to have available next year. Does that make sense? So, gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country within a period of time. We can divide GDP up into 4 components. Because GDP is total spending, we can divide it up into components based on who is doing the spending. So we have 4 components: consumption spending, which is household consumers; investment spending, which is firms and businesses; government expenditure or government purchases, which is stuff the government buys and pays for; and then net exports, which allows us to consider other countries buying our stuff. So we can graph this out or sort of map this out alphabetically with these by simplifying this to say that Y is national income, or GDP, is equal to C for consumption plus I for investment plus G for government spending plus NX for net exports. Just like we have on the board there, right? So those are our 4 components of GDP: consumption spending, investment spending, government expenditure, and net exports. What do they all mean? Well, they all have different components to them, right? They all have a little bit of a different meaning. Consumption spending is total spending on goods and services by households, by average people like you and me. Consumption spending includes rent payments, right? Because you're consuming some quantity of housing every month. For homeowners, however, we don't want to, again, double count things or miscount them. And so what we do for homeowners is we don't count their mortgage or the purchase price of the house. We count what is called imputed rental value, which is basically just saying, based on the size of the home, let's say you buy a 4-bedroom house, we would not count what you actually paid for the house when you purchased it. Instead, we would count the monthly rent that you would pay in the market. And that way we are just counting your current consumption of housing. Hopefully that makes sense. This is not the most important thing. The most important thing is remembering that consumption spending is household goods and services expenditure. So it's you and me and everyone you know spending money on groceries and electricity and Pokemon cards and video games and anything else. Investment spending is total spending on goods that would be used to produce more goods in the future. Not intermediate goods, right? But it's going to be things like factories, machines and tools, office buildings, maybe a computer that you use for your business. It also includes inventories for goods not yet sold. So if I build 1,000 cars and I only sell 900 of them this year, then the remaining 100 cars become investment because I produced them this year, but I'm going to hold them in stock and use them later. Does that make sense? That's kind of a tricky thing. But the idea here is that we want to make sure we're only counting the productivity we have for this period. So if there's something we don't sell, we count it as part of our company investment in future sales. So if I make 100 desks and I don't sell all of them, they become part of, if I sell it to you, it becomes consumption spending. If I don't sell it, then it's my investment in future sales. When we're talking about investment right now, we're not going to be talking about buying stocks and bonds or anything like that. So far, so good? Okay. Government purchases is anything the government buys. That's federal government, state government, local government, buying tanks, buying airplanes, buying parks, building schools, buying land for Sac State, right? It doesn't include transfer payments. And transfer payments is when the government gives you money. So stimulus checks, not a government purchase. Social Security, not a government purchase. Unemployment insurance, not a government purchase. To test whether something's a government purchase, you just have to see if the government actually got something for it, right? Building a road, there's a road. They bought metal and concrete to build the road. That's a government expenditure. Sending somebody TANF for groceries, that's transferring money. Right? That's a transfer payment. That's not buying something for someone. So that's the important thing. So transfer payments are not purchases of goods and services, but any other government expenditure where the government buys something. That's part of GDP. Net exports is exports minus imports, where exports are foreign spending on our goods and services, and imports are our consumption of other countries' goods and services. And the idea here is we want to make sure we count stuff we produce that other people pay for, but not count the stuff that we buy from other folks. And so when we take exports minus imports, we get the value of the domestically bought and sold goods. So adding it all together, we get Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Total GDP, total national income, is equal to consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. Cool? So now that we have the components of real GDP, of our measure of national income, let's talk about it in real terms. First of all, here we've got the components of GDP in 2020. There are obviously older and newer versions of this data, but this is GDP in 2020, broken down into total national income, which is $20 trillion, 20.89 trillion or dollars. And then we have consumption spending, which is about 14 trillion or 67% of total GDP. Investment spending, 17% or 3 trillion, 3.6 trillion. Government spending, 3.8 trillion. That's higher than usual. Previous years, we had lower government spending be a lower percentage than investment spending, but we can think about 2020, the government was spending a lot of money on COVID supplies, right? On PPE, on vaccines and that kind of thing. And so that bumped up that government spending higher than it usually is. And then net exports tends to be negative in the US. We buy a lot of goods and services from other countries. We export a lot, but not near as much as we buy from everywhere else, which isn't a problem. But we do see that net exports is negative. And then here's the per capita measure. So for the 330 million people in the United States, total GDP per capita is about $63,000. And then it gets broken down again into consumption, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. And so we can think about how big of a portion of GDP consumption spending is. Net exports is a small negative sliver, and then government spending and investment spending are about the same size. But consumption spending is about 2/3 of US GDP. So we could talk about real GDP a couple of other different ways. One way we can do it is we can do a little self-test here. And so these active learning things, we've done them in class before. They're a really great chance to kind of check with yourself that you have an understanding of what's going on in a given chapter. So here we have 4 different situations. We want to see if a component of GDP is affected and which one and by how much. So we have 4 situations. We have Sarah spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at a fancy restaurant in Boston. Liz spends $1,200 on a new laptop for her publishing business, and the laptop was built in China. Joss spends $800 on a computer to use in his editing business, and he used last year's model on sale. So we got a good price. And then General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, and consumers only buy $470 million worth of them. So there's a couple of things in here. The first one hopefully is kind of straightforward. Sarah spends a bunch of money on a fancy dinner. That counts as consumption spending, right? That's going to increase consumption component of GDP by $300. The total sum of that goes into those services, right? Those goods and services, the services of the staff at the restaurant and the goods of the food at the restaurant. B, a little trickier, Liz spends money on a new laptop for her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. In this case, it's a business expense, right, because it's for her publishing business, and it's also an export, right? It's something bought by somewhere else. So it's going to contribute to It contributes to investment spending, but it's also a imported good from another country. And so we see it be subtracted in the net exports and added in the investment. And so it's no effect. There's no effect on GDP because it's not something we produced in this country. Does that make sense? Because it was produced in China, it's got a negative effect on GDP even though Liz bought it in the country at the time. This next one is a little bit trickier. So now Joss is spending $800 on a computer for his business, but it's last year's model, and it was on sale because the local manufacturer was trying to get it out. In this case, because it was produced last year, it doesn't count to this year's GDP. Remember, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country within a period of time. If it was built last year, it's not going to count towards this year's GDP because it wasn't manufactured this year. Does that make sense? It's last year's work. So it would have been counted last year, but it can't be counted this year because then we would be double counting that productivity. And we want to make sure we're only counting things once. And that's going to help inform our understanding of the answer to D. D says General Motors built $500 million worth of cars. Consumers bought $470 million. Where does that all go? Well, if consumers buy $470 million worth of cars, that's going to be a lot of consumption spending. But what about the remaining $30 million worth of cars? That is going to go into investment. The investment category, remember, also tracks inventory. And so if General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, it's all going to add up into GDP. The majority of it, $470 million, that's consumption spending. Consumers bought those cars. The remaining $30 million that GM didn't sell goes towards investment because they still produced them within the year, and they'll sell them in the future. But we don't want to count the productivity of this year somewhere down the road. We want to count it now when it happened. And so to do that, we count it as an investment in inventory. So it's a little tricky. We'll talk about it more. It's not the most important thing in the world to totally fully understand. But the big idea here is that whatever we count, we want to make sure we count the final goods and services produced within the country within a year. And we want to make sure we're not double counting things. And that's why we have those strict rules about counting things within a year, and making sure that we do count it in the year it's produced, because we're trying to count our productivity. So what else can we say to complicate this issue? Well, we have also this idea of real versus nominal. And this gets at something that we're going to talk about more throughout the semester, this idea of inflation. And inflation is kind of back in the news. We're talking about seeing some inflation. They were just talking about the Federal Reserve is concerned because we're at about 4% inflation right now, which is higher than expected. Inflation is just growth in the price level. It's prices going up, right? It's the whole thing where someone says, oh, movies used to cost $1, now they cost $20. Inflation distorts economic variables, especially variables like GDP. So we have two different measures or versions of GDP. Nominal GDP uses the values of output with current prices, and it does not correct for inflation. So if you think about the prices we all perceive today, those are nominal variables, right? The current prices are baked into what we're talking about. If we want to take the inflation out and get the real uninflated values, that's going to be real GDP. And we can measure real GDP by looking at output using base year prices. So real GDP is going to correct for inflation. So nominal stuff is stuff that's not corrected for inflation. It's prices that you perceive out there today. It's GDP that's not corrected for inflation. Real variables, real GDP is corrected for inflation, and so we use prices for some previous base year period to do that. Does that kind of make sense? So inflation is changes in the price level. If we want to correct for inflation, we won't use current prices. We'll use old prices so that we can say, oh, this is how much more we've produced holding prices at 1980s values or something like that. So let's look at an example. Here we have an example of GDP for a small country that only produces pizza and lattes, because we love pizza and lattes in this class. In this case, we have every year, we have a price and a quantity for pizzas and lattes, and those go up because prices tend to go up, but also our productivity tends to go up. And so we'll see both of those go up each year. We can calculate the nominal GDP by saying, okay, in 2011, we produced 400 pizzas, and the market value of those 400 pizzas was $10. We also produced 1,000 lattes, and the 1,000 lattes had a market value of $2. So the GDP for this country that produces two goods is $10 times the 400 pizzas and $2 times the 1,000 lattes. That gives us nominal GDP of $6,000. In 2012, we do the same thing. We'd say, okay, this year we produced 500 pizzas and we produced 1,100 lattes. The pizzas are worth $11 and each latte sold for $2.50. So we now have the market value of the goods and services produced within our weird little pizza latte country in the period we're talking about, which is 2012. So it's $11 times 500 pizzas, $2.50 times 1,100 lattes. Excuse me. Add those together. I'm so sorry for the yawn. Add those together, and that gives you the GDP. Same thing for 2013. Our country produced 600 pizzas at $12 each, 1,200 lattes at $3 each, and so we use those figures to calculate nominal GDP. And you can see here, the prices going up, that's inflation. So we're not correcting for inflation because we're using the current prices for every year, and we're just saying, okay, well, this is nominal GDP without correcting for inflation. If we wanted to, we could measure the increase in nominal GDP and say, okay, well, from $6,000 to $8,250 represents a 37.5% increase in nominal GDP. And then from 2012 to 2013, we see nominal GDP go up by another 30.9%. The other thing we can do is we can calculate real GDP in each period. And so to calculate real GDP, what we're going to want to do is use the quantities from each year, whatever year we're in, but we want to pick a base year and use the prices from the base year. So we're going to use 2011 as the base year, and we're going to use those base year prices and the quantity for each year we go through. So for 2011, it's easy to do the GDP because real GDP using our base year prices is that same amount, $10 times 400 pizzas, $2 times 1,000 lattes gives us real GDP of $6,000. Real GDP for the base year is going to be the same as nominal GDP because we don't change the prices. Where things get interesting is when we get into the real GDP for 2012. Because in 2012, we're going to continue to use those 2011 prices and the current year quantity. So we've got 2012, we're going to say 500 pizzas is what we produce, but we're going to use the 2011 prices because we want to correct for inflation. If inflation is prices going up, by holding prices constant in a base year, we correct for inflation. And now the nominal, or rather the real GDP for 2012 shows us a little bit less growth than what we were expecting from nominal GDP. Nominal GDP had the price growth and the quantity growth. Now we're holding the prices the same and we're just looking at the change in productivity. So $10 for 500 pizzas and $2 for 1,100 lattes gives us a real GDP of $7,200. 2013, we do the exact same thing. We hold the prices constant in 2011, so we'll say a $10 pizza, but in 2013 we made 600 pizzas, so we'll do 600 times 10. In 2013, we also made 1,200 lattes, but we're holding the price constant in that 2011 base year. So the real GDP for 2013 is going to be $10 times 600 plus $2 times 1,200, or $8,400. When we go through and look at the increases in real GDP, it's a lot smaller than the increases in nominal GDP were, right? Go back and look. We can kind of scroll back through and see. Here's nominal GDP, and you can see the values are larger and the increases are larger. That's because we added those larger prices in. Inflation made the difference bigger. When we take inflation out, we're going to see the increases be smaller because now we're just looking at the change in quantity over time. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. We'll talk more about this as we go through. So here's our example, and we can see in each year, nominal GDP is measured using current prices, and then real GDP is measured using base period prices. And that gives us a measure of GDP that corrects for inflation when we use those base year prices. So the change in real GDP is the amount GDP would have changed if there was zero inflation and prices didn't go up. And economists like to know that because we want to separate out the changes in productivity from the changes in price change, right? The price changes. And we can see here, if you look at it over time, real GDP and nominal GDP have mostly been the same. There's a big difference in the inflation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. As we get closer to the base year, which is 2009, they crisscross. You can also see the little divot here from the Great Recession. And then because 2009 is the base year, they're going to be the same in the base year. And then inflation makes nominal GDP higher than real GDP. Hopefully that makes some sense. So if we can use GDP, real and nominal GDP, to pull the inflation out, we can also use a GDP deflator. The GDP deflator, which helps us measure changes in inflation. So one way to measure an economy's inflation is to calculate the GDP deflator. And you just take that nominal GDP, divide it by real GDP, and multiply it by 100. And that gets you exactly where you want to be. So a GDP deflator is just nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So in this case, we can calculate the GDP deflator for our world where we have the pizza and lattes society, economy, because we have nominal and real GDP. So we'll divide nominal by real and multiply it by 100, and we get 6,000 divided by 6,000 is 1 times 100 gives us a GDP deflator of, 100. What about 2012? This is when things get interesting. Now, nominal GDP is higher than real GDP. So we've seen an increase in inflation. So 8,250 divided by 7,200 gives us 1.146. Multiply that by 100 and we get 114.6. That's how much inflation has gone up in a year. The next year we use the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP and then multiply it by 100. And again, we get a GDP deflator that shows that the price level is going up, that inflation is going up. So the first year inflation goes up by 14%. The second year inflation goes up by another 12%. Does that make sense? Ooh. Come on, buddy. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, I would recommend you go through and try solving this practice problem here. It goes through and asks you to compute nominal GDP in 2011 and then compute real GDP in 2012 and then find the GDP deflator in 2013. And so for nominal GDP in 2011, remember you're going to want to use the price and quantity for 2011 and the price and quantity in 2011 for good A and good B. For real GDP in 2012, you want to use the 2012 quantities and the 2011 prices. And then if you want to get the GDP deflator for 2013, you want to get the real and the nominal GDP for 2013. And this is a really great way to go through and test your knowledge of it because the next slides go through and show how you can go through and solve the problem and gives you the answers and all of that. So I'm going to skip through it and give you the opportunity to test yourselves and give that a try. And then we'll talk really quickly about whether or not GDP is a good measure of economic well-being. So remember we said in the beginning with Mankey's 10 principles that a country's standard of living is dependent on its ability to produce goods and services. And one of the ways we can measure a country's standard of living and a country's ability to produce goods and services is with GDP per capita. Real GDP per person or per capita is our main indicator of a person's standard of living. It's not perfect though. It doesn't value a lot of things that are actually pretty important, like leisure time, like environmental quality, air quality, and it also doesn't really pick up any of the non-market activities. So if you provide free childcare to your family, I watch my kid at home, if you take care of family members, if you clean or cook for yourself, that doesn't have any value according to GDP. And GDP doesn't measure the equitability or the equality of income distribution. It just says, hey, there's a bunch of money out there. So for example, per capita GDP in 2020 was $62,000. I don't know about y'all, but I didn't get my $62,000, so somebody else must have it, right? So that's some of the problems with GDP. We still care about it because it still is a pretty good indicator of the economic well-being of a country's ability to produce goods and services, and the higher a country's GDP, the more likely they are to have good schools, a cleaner environment, better health care, etc. GDP is actually linked with really positive qualities of life, and we can see here, if we look at GDP percent change over time, it shows us when things were bad and good in the economy, right? First quarter, that's January, February, March, GDP was positive up until March when things really tanked. The next quarter of 2020, things were really bad, right? COVID-19 was a really bad situation. But the economy has recovered and GDP has recovered, and we see that in this positive percent change in GDP over time. We can also look at data on life expectancy and real GDP per capita and see that they're positively correlated. As real GDP goes up, people tend to live longer. We can compare real GDP per capita or per person to average years of education. The more money a country makes, the more likely they are to have a well-educated population. And we can also add it to other things that are important, like water quality. And so the big idea here is that GDP is a great measure of national income. It's broken down into consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. It's the total market value of final goods and services produced within a country within a period of time. We can break it down into real versus nominal to correct for inflation. And even though it's not perfect, it's still a good measure of a country's well-being. So, hopefully that makes sense. GDP is a measure of national income, a measure of our productivity. We use it to look at current period production, which is why we don't count stuff from the past. But we don't want to count stuff from the future. We only want to count things we produce in our country this year. We also want to think about it being Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. And we're also going to use Y a lot as our measure of national income and national productivity. And that's a great way to think about this. We'll talk more about inflation and real versus nominal variables, and GDP is going to come up a lot. So you want to get comfortable just kind of thinking about what it means, what it measures, and where it comes from, right? So it's going to keep popping up. So is inflation. We'll talk more about inflation going forward, and we'll bring all these things together. Let me know what questions you have. Have a beautiful rest of the day. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.